Second Nature, we'll take an in-depth look at human memory. We did. Greetings, prisoners of gravity. This is Commander Rick. Look what I taped off of CNN.
Hi, I'm Teen Talk Barbie, the spokesdoll for the BLO. That stands for the Barbie Liberation Organization. We've turned against our creators because they use us to brainwash kids. They build us in a way that perpetuates gender-based stereotypes. In order to correct this problem, we have set up our own hospitals where we are carrying out corrective surgery on ourselves.
Dead men tell no tales. Troops, attack!
I donated my voice to a G.I. Joe, because they want to be free, too.
Will we ever have enough clothes? Let's take a dance class.
We are now available in stores near you.
Back in December of '93, a few hundred of these role-reverse dolls did reach store shelves, but most still spouted sexist stereotypes. And what can the BLO do about the Barbie and G.I. Joe comic books? Switch covers? I mean, come on. This week on Prisoners of Gravity, sexism in comic books and science fiction. First, my clever computer Nancy will run our opening credits. Nancy, how did you do that?
Rising anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe has voted English-only sign. 40,000 tons of armed with PCBs blew up the ozone layer today.
Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
Picture this. Comic book artist Linda Medley tries to sell her artwork at a comic convention with no luck. When she's off at lunch, Linda's brother watches over her table, and he sells a ton of her artwork because people assume he drew it. That true story is in A Century of Women Cartoonists by Trina Robbins, the second book Trina has produced about the obstacles that women creators have faced since the beginning of comics and cartooning.
At the turn of the century, they were doing a lot. They kind of specialized in comics that had women and children in them. And when I researched my book, Women in the Comics, which is a history of women doing comics, when I first saw all these women doing women and children, my first feeling, you know, because I can't break away from the fact that I was raised in a male culture and raised with male values, my first feeling was, this is so banal, this is so petty, just comics about women and children. And I was a little embarrassed, even though the art was beautiful and the stories were funny. And then I thought about it, and I said, whoa, you know, in a society where men drew women and children and women drew superheroes, women and children comics would be considered very, very important, and superhero comics would be considered petty and banal.
Good point. But why are comics, at least in North America, such a male-oriented art form?
If I knew that, I might be able to change it, but it certainly is an interesting phenomenon. We know that in Japan there are so many comics specifically for girls and women. We know that in Europe, in Italy and in France, there are comics that men and women read that aren't aimed at anything except intelligent reading people. But in North America, the industry certainly is controlled totally, you know, with so few exceptions that I think I can say 99% totally by males. And I often wonder if these males want to reach women.
Yes, but not in their comics. Superhero comics are still a boys' club. The Marine Corps has more fighting women than Marvel or DC, although DC has recently added the character Anima to their roster. But the superheroine with the biggest numbers in terms of monthly sales and upper torso measurements is Wonder Woman. Dreamed up in 1940 by a psychologist named William Moulton Marston, Wonder Woman remained a boys-only production until 1986, when Trina Robbins wrote and drew a 4-issue miniseries. Since Trina, a number of talented women have drawn Wonder Woman, including Colleen Doran. Colleen also drew issue number 20 of The Sandman, one of the few North American comics read by both sexes in almost equal numbers. But she's best known for her series A Distant Soil, which she created, writes, and draws. This swashbuckling space opera mixes Arthurian swordplay with alien spaceships. Colleen, it's the commander. As a female comic creator, have you faced any special challenges?
Oh, sure. Dirty old men, you know. You know, 75-year-old fellows that are looking for a Lolita or something. That was pretty gruesome. I started in the business when I was very young. I got my first professional work when I was 15, and even though I usually traveled with a chaperone, it didn't seem to make that much difference. You know, some of the people in the business just look at conventions as a singles bar type deal, and you know, somebody offers you a job, and the next thing you know, they're hitting on you, and that can be really, really tough. And it doesn't happen to me as much anymore because everybody knows what a bitch I am. But when I was a teenager, and you know, when I was in my early 20s and so forth, I had a lot of problems. It was really gruesome.
Do you also find that you're not taken seriously in the business negotiation side because you're a woman?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I used to be a blonde. I got so tired of being called a dumb blonde, I dyed my hair red. Not that it makes any difference. They just think I have a bad temper now. But you just don't get taken seriously at all, period. And everyone seems to think that, you know, when you open your mouth and speak, it's some sort of mind scramble. Wow, she speaks.
Well, hey, even Barbie is surprising people these days. So how do you deal with that kind of mentality?
I'm sidestepping the issue by starting my own business. By doing Aria Press and publishing A Distant Soil myself. I don't have to worry about an editor saying, well, you know, we don't know if we should hire you to draw this book. I mean, you're a girl, and, you know, this is superheroes, and there's lots of testosterone, and you may ovulate in the middle of an issue and totally ruin it and give it girl cooties. So I don't have to worry about that when I publish my own work. And after all of these years, I'm actually doing a superhero series for DC Comics, which is really great because the editor does not have that attitude at all. There are some editors. It's not the company as a whole, but the individuals that you have to deal with. And they come and they go, and things change, and I'm working with some pretty good guys right now.
Well, I hope things stay that way. Thanks, Colleen. Another of my favorite artists is Jill Thompson. Jill has also drawn Wonder Woman and The Sandman, and she's the regular penciler on DC's Black Orchid series. Black Orchid is a superheroine, and she's a flower. Sort of a kinder, gentler Swamp Thing. I mean, she packs a pistol, but not the kind that shoots. Jill, why do you think so many female artists end up working on comics that have female leads, like Wonder Woman or Black Orchid?
Can I swear on this?
Oh, hell yes.
Because it's a stupid and useless and shitty stereotype. I don't know, they think, oh, they'll bring some kind of sensitive perspective to this comic, and that's the only thing that they can draw. But it gets me mad. It's like women in comics panels. God, I hate those things. I'm never going to be on another one in my life. And the only reason I'd go on them is to say, I think this women in comics panel is really stupid. We shouldn't be on it because we're just pigeonholing ourselves. Why aren't we on just a writers in comics panel or creators in comics? No one ever asks you, and you don't volunteer for it. Trina Robbins is like the champion of women in comics panels, and I know that she means well, but I really think it's just like one step forward, two steps back. I don't want to be associated as a woman in comics. I want to be associated as, oh, Jill's my favorite comics creator, period. Or I love Jill's art, period, the way they would say it about anybody else.
For 50 years, the power structure of comics, where control resided in the hands of a few men, conspired against women creators. But with today's alternate comic lines and self-publishing, things are changing, slowly. Contrast that to science fiction, where women like C.L. Moore, Lee Brackett, and Judith Merril were being published in the 30s and 40s. Then in the 1960s, a new wave of women like Octavia Butler, Marion Zimmer Bradley, and Ursula Le Guin introduced a fresh feminist style of story. And now, Well, look at all the women who won Hugo and Nebula Awards recently. And the Campbell Award for Best New SF Author went to women 8 times out of 10 between 1984 and 93. On the other hand, the Grandmaster Nebula, which honors a lifetime of work, has only been awarded to one woman, Alice Mary Norton. Why did you decide to write under the name Andre Norton?
Because when I first started writing, which was a good many years ago, I started out with what they called adventure stories. And in those days, the only market for adventure stories was supposedly a masculine one. And they would not allow books by a woman writer, the publishers. And so I chose a name that could be either masculine or feminine, because I use it without the accent. And from then on, I made it my legal name, and from then on I have used it.
Did you find the science fiction of the 40s and 50s terribly sexist?
I wasn't struck by that at that time, though I know that the majority of the science fiction novels of that time either had no women at all, or the woman stood by and wrung her hands while the hero was engaged in something.
And after he saved her, they got engaged.
Yes, she got to be the prize.
Right. Now, I always felt that you were trying to shatter that helpless stereotype in your young adult fiction.
Well, I felt that it was, beginning with Ordeal in Otherwhere, I felt that it was the thing to do, and from then on I had feminine characters.
So was Ordeal in Otherwhere the first time you used a female protagonist?
Yes, and I did that for a very good reason. I hate to say this, but I was accused of writing homosexual books because I had no woman in them. So I turned right around and wrote Ordeal in Otherwhere, and the editor said, no, it won't go. They don't want a woman. And I said, well, take it and see, and it did go. And now I have more feminine readers than I do male.
Far more women read science fiction now than they did even in the 70s. They began reading it more in the 70s. Far more women were writing science fiction in the 70s, getting published in the 70s. So that built up this audience. So now you have a lot more, people don't have it's not a boys' own literature of these heterosexual macho men having adventures in outer space with each other, with the women back home, you know, keeping the home fires burning and staying out of it. I think it would be very unusual now to find the sort of letter in a science fiction magazine that you would find back in the 50s and even in the 60s of someone writing in and saying, keep sex out of science fiction, and equating sex with women. You know, with the idea that as soon as you have women characters, you're going to have sex, and that somehow spoils what science fiction is all about. I think it's now seen that one of the areas that science fiction has to deal with is interpersonal relationships, family relationships, how children are raised, how people relate to each other sexually as well as every other way.
Well, you've tackled all those themes in your stories. In fact, having just reread Husbands, I've got to ask why your protagonist suggests that in a society where men have been eliminated, little girls would invent something to take the place of sexism.
I just don't believe in the kind of idea of evil male men kind of coming along and pounding down the poor little helpless women and forcing them into this situation. I think, well, women have done it too. I mean, it's women and men have created these differences. So in Husbands, the idea was that now, once this kind of utopia had been reached of everyone the same sex and everyone happy and no one oppressed, that people are going to be desperately looking for some way, not necessarily of becoming oppressed again, but that was in the second story. There are 3 stories. In the middle story, it's about people recreating oppression. You know, give them happiness, and they'll sort of busily find a way to create a new hierarchy and to create punishments. At the end, it was a slightly more happy version of that. It was the idea of difference rather than of oppression. And so she creates, you know, from what's filtered down from culture, this kind of long ago culture where there were these things called women and these things called men, and these things, some of these men were husbands, and they were particularly desirable, and you wanted to have one. So she's decided to make one, but she's already thought very carefully about all the dangers of that, and she's not going to create a husband who can beat her up or lock her in the house or anything. So she's going to has to create this husband that actually lives in a different environment from her entirely, so they can only make special efforts to get together occasionally.
A feminist utopia also features in Connie Willis's Hugo and Nebula award-winning short story, Even the Queen. But in this liberated future, a regressive cult of women want to bring back menstruation. No thanks. Period. In the mid-70s, science fiction produced 3 innovative utopian novels, each featuring female leads, and each using a standard science fiction theme. The Female Man by Joanna Russ explores an angry alternate reality. In Woman on the Edge of Time, Marge Piercy spins a heartbreaking time travel tale, while The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin involves a very exotic alien world. While fictional utopias can show what might be possible, I've been impressed with the imaginative ways that authors have attacked the harsh reality of sexism. In the story so far, your central character, Emmy, is stuck on the sidelines of someone else's story. And while the story that she's stuck in isn't science fiction, I certainly felt that you were criticizing how SF has failed female characters.
There are a lot of science fiction stories, as well as other stories, in which women basically are props. They're background. They're something that the male characters, who are the ones doing interesting things and thinking interesting thoughts, are contrasted against, or the woman's reaction to them shows that this is a desirable, strong, virile man, or shows that this is not an interesting man because the beautiful woman ignores him. The women are used more as archetypes than they are as human beings in too many stories. Not in all stories, of course, but in too many stories. And the story that, in this story, the character, it's a story about a character in a story who is, however, thinking her own thoughts, is she's being forced to puppet all of these lines that some author somewhere has written for her. I mean, she realizes this through the story. She realizes that this is a story about a man because men are human beings, and that she and another woman in the story are just props to show what kind of life he's living, you know, who he'd marry, who he would have an affair with, you know, and it has more to do with what they look like and, you know, what they're saying in the background than what kind of human beings they are. Oh, sure, it's a criticism.
One of my favorite criticisms, this was from another writer, a person whose work I respect, who was telling me about The Falling Woman. He said, would you like to hear a problem I had with it? What I see as a problem in the book. I said, sure, fine, what was the problem? He said, there aren't any strong male characters. I said, oh, that's interesting. And I don't see that as a problem in the book. I've never heard anyone criticize Moby Dick saying there aren't any strong women characters. I mean, there's a couple of whales with bit parts that are female. Other than that, it's all boys. So I thought it was very interesting that the perception was that because this book dealt primarily with a mother and daughter and with the relationships among women, it was a woman's book, and that eliminated the rest of the population. I think there's a great many novels out there that everyone regards as classics that are about father-son relationships. So I find it a little odd to talk about works as feminist simply because they deal with women and the relationships among women.
Chelsea, would you call yourself a feminist?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I can date my feminism to one particular incident in 3rd grade, which was we were doing a math problem. And it was one of those time motion things. And these boys are building a raft, and they're going to take it out on the lake. And it's so many nails for so many boards for so many feet, blah-de-blah-de-blah. How long will it take them to build the raft? Well, it turns out that they will not get it made in time to go out on the lake that day. So they that was the word, they let these girls carry nails for them. And of course, they can't carry as many nails, but they help. And then while the boys are out on the raft, the girls go back and make them cookies. And how many cookies can they make in the length of time the boys are gone? Well, I was outraged, and I just absolutely, you know, exploded in class saying, you know, if I'm going to help make anybody's raft, I'm going to go ride on it myself. I'm not going to stay home and make them cookies. And I ended up going to the principal's office and stuff like that, and they didn't know why, you know, why was this bothering me? And I, you know, at that point in the 50s, you were not saying things like, you know, this is unfair and this is evil and this is bad, because it was assumed that this was the natural order of the universe. But it reminded me that, you know, the suffragettes hadn't actually won everything for us yet. Just because we could vote, it didn't necessarily get us what we wanted.
The natural order of the universe. There's why so many women are writing science fiction, because they can play with the social order, the political order, the biological order. And a growing number of the boys have been trying it too. John Varley has drawn critical and popular acclaim for the capable, confident women who are the lead characters in most of his fiction. And David Brin's novel, Glory Season, is set on a planet run by women, where young Maya is relegated to second-class status, not because she's female, but because she had a father. Ew, couldn't your family afford a test tube? Is Glory Season a feminist novel?
Well, it's a feminist novel the way I consider myself a feminist. Science fiction has always been, I think, at the cutting edge in this issue for its time. The fiction of, 40 years ago doesn't read very feminist now, but I've always tried to have strong female characters in my novels. In Earth, my character, Teresa Ticana, was a shuttle pilot, space shuttle pilot.
Right.
In Glory Season, I had no trouble with the idea of dealing with matriarchy. It's a hot topic in science fiction now. There are a lot of people contending that we'd all be in better shape if more female forms of wisdom ruled the world. They say, for instance, how could things be worse than they are now, having been run by men? Well, I take some exception with that, but I certainly think it's an experiment worth trying, worth lots of exploration. And I was both intrigued and provoked by some of the matriarchies I've been reading lately. I wanted to come up with a world in which the founders wanted to reduce the power and influence of men, but did not dislike men. Didn't want to exile them to the far Purda or far frontiers. They wanted to have them around. They liked having them around, but they just didn't want them making so much noise.
Samuel, you've been described as a feminist author. How do you feel about that term?
About the way I would hope a white writer would feel if they were described as a black militant. I think it's a contradiction in terms. I don't think a man can be a feminist.
And yet, in book after book, your female characters seem so authentic and rounded. What's your secret, then?
I don't know whether I have one. There was a time when I was asked this question fairly frequently, what is it about your female characters, that makes them better than other female characters? And what I used to say is that when I read female characters, both in science fiction and outside of science fiction, when I was, in my late teens and early 20s, I had noticed that there was a tendency, an overwhelming tendency, not to give the female characters the same range of actions that you gave the male characters. So one of the things I did as a younger writer is I tried to go out of my way to make sure that my women characters had purposeful actions, gratuitous actions, and habitual actions. And I would practically sit down and make a list, check them off.
Right.
I think this helped to a certain extent. And I did get a lot of compliments on my women characters, often from women who would notice this. I think they were more aware of this than the men were. I think the men readers were. But from time to time, I would also get the response, well, your female characters they're richer than a lot of other writers' characters, but they're also pretty schematic. It's like to check them off on a list. Oh, is it showing? Yes. So the next thing to do is to try and make the whole thing a little bit more organic, a little bit more to hold together and not feel so much like, as it is done on a list with, one then the other then the other.
In the mid-70s, as Delaney published novels featuring liberated, progressive societies, one writer scorned the notion of a happy paradise. Nancy, open a line to Albuquerque, please. In Walk to the End of the World, Susie McKee Charnas put strong, interesting female characters in the most oppressive, male-dominated society she could imagine, a primitive post-nuclear nightmare. Ah, hello, Susie, it's Commander Rick. I've been talking about Walk to the End of the World again, and I wondered, is sexism likely to be part of the fallout from an apocalypse?
Oh, gosh, yes. Every time things get bad, those who are stronger take it out on those who are weaker. And by definition, those who are weaker are usually women and kids. I mean, look at Somalia. Who's doing the dying in Somalia? Look at the pictures and the photographs. Who's doing the suffering in Bosnia? It's always the women and the kids. And that's just a matter of kind of primate social structure, I think, that, you know, the big tough ones take away from the weaker, smaller ones.
With all the sexism and hatred towards women in the novel, what was the toughest part for you to write?
Oh, it started right at the beginning, right when there's a little scene on the beach where there are people at night. They're all women and they're all working on the seaweed. And the two major male characters are walking down the beach. And just to see that through their eyes it just kicked off something in my head. I said, what am I doing? And then I thought, well, that's what this book is about, dear. What you're doing is what you set out to do without knowing what you were doing. But it was right at the start. As soon as I realized that the women were all slaves, I said, oh, boy, what have I let myself in for?
Now, Walk to the End of the World and the sequel, Motherlines, were written in the 70s, but the third book in the series, The Furies, was written in the 90s. How is it different from how you might have written it back in the 70s?
Well, it's a lot meaner. It's a lot madder. It's a lot more violent. The Furies is an expression of the idea that there cannot be healing of this kind of terrible, terrible injury to the social body, which is sexism, without anger. A lot of people, men and women, would, including me, would dearly love to see us all fall into each other's arms and say, gosh, we're not going to do any more of this, all is forgiven, let's start over and make it better. I don't think that's possible, any more than I think that white people and black people can do that. I think there's so much injury and retaliatory pain that has been dealt from both sides that a great deal of rage has been repressed. So the book is in a way an attempt to express that anger imaginatively rather than to do it in reality. And maybe then we won't have to do it in reality. And I don't think, if I were writing it in the 70s, we were all much more rational then. I mean, we really thought we could talk our way through this. And I think it's recently become clear that we can only talk our way through so much of it. We can't talk our way through all of it. Some of it, we have to scream our way through.
Right. Thanks, Susie. It's interesting that during the 40s and 50s, a strong theme in science fiction by men was the libertarian message of freedom, tolerance, independence, self-reliance, opportunity, themes that have been championed by feminist writers, which might explain why so many readers like me, who grew up reading SF written mostly by men, are such fans of the innovative new science fiction by women. Next week on Second Nature, neuroscientists working to program a computer with an artificial intelligence and an artificial personality have developed the fully artificial basic intelligence organism, or FABIO for short.